Some houses don't forget. You can clean them, repaint the walls, change the furniture, but the memories remain, like fingerprints under the surface. Julia knew this house too well. Every creak in the floorboards, every chipped tile, every echo in the hallway reminded her of who she used to be, and who she was trying not to become again. The house was hers now, legally, formally, but it didn't feel like a win. Just a hand-me-down from a life that no longer fit. The divorce had gone quietly. No screaming, no theatrics. Just signatures on documents that divided two lives with ink and indifference. She got the house. He got the car, and the silence he always claimed he needed. Everyone said she should be relieved, but relief didn't come. Instead, came the weight of rooms too quiet, of shadows that moved like memories, of spaces where laughter once lived, but now stood abandoned. Julia didn't move back in right away. She needed time, distance. The house had been empty for months when she finally returned. She parked in the driveway, stared at the front door, and waited, like the house might blink first. Then she walked up, key in hand, each step heavier than the last. When she opened the door, a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of dust and disuse. Inside, everything was exactly as they left it. The couch, the clock on the wall, frozen at 3:14 p.m. Even the mug in the sink, chipped on the rim, just like their marriage. She didn't cry. Not then. The tears had dried weeks ago, replaced by a quiet numbness that wrapped around her like insulation. She wandered room to room like an archaeologist brushing dust off relics from a life she no longer recognized. In the bedroom, the bed seemed smaller than she remembered. The kitchen echoed too much. And the hallway, that hallway, stretched out like a tunnel to nowhere. She unpacked little, just the basics, enough to survive, not to settle. But there was one place she hadn't gone yet. One door she avoided, even as she passed it daily. The basement. It was just a storage space. Cold, unfinished, filled with tools, boxes, and things neither of them wanted to deal with. But somehow it felt heavier than that, like something had been left behind. Something more than old paint cans and Christmas lights. Tuesday. That was the day she finally went down. She stood before the basement door with the kind of hesitation reserved for horror films and bad memories. The knob was brass, tarnished, cool to the touch. She turned it. Slowly. Carefully. The hinges moaned, and darkness stared back up at her. The light switch clicked. But nothing happened. Of course. She retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. It was right where she remembered it. Buried beneath loose pens, rubber bands, a roll of tape that had long since dried out. She flicked it on. A narrow beam pierced the black. She descended the stairs, one at a time, each step complaining under her weight. The basement smelled of damp stone and old wood. A tangle of spiderwebs clung to the corners. Nothing had moved, except one thing. In the far corner, behind an old armchair and a stack of boxes, was a trunk she didn't recognize. It wasn't large. Not new. Wooden with metal corners and a leather strap that hung like a forgotten handle. A thin sheet covered it, faded and gray. She stared at it. Longer than she meant to. There was something strange about it. Not just its presence, but the way it seemed to hum in the silence. She stepped forward, each footstep echoing through the cement floor. She pulled back the sheet. Dust bloomed in the air. The trunk was locked with two latches. Her fingers hovered above them. Just a trunk, she told herself. Just things. Click. First latch opened, then the second. The lid creaked. The hinges protested. Inside weren't tools, or photo albums, or forgotten clothes. There were notebooks. Dozens of them, stacked neatly, like they'd been placed there with care. Each notebook was different in color, but identical in size, worn along the edges. The kind you'd find in the back of a school supply store. Simple, quiet, unassuming. But they weren't old accounting records or forgotten sketches. Each one had a year written across the cover in his handwriting. 2016. 2017, 2018. Year after year, a silent chronology of a life she thought she had lived beside him, but now wasn't so sure. She pulled out the one marked 2017. Her fingertips brushed the soft paper. That was the year everything cracked. The year the nursery stayed empty, the year she changed, and he grew quieter with each passing day. She opened it. March 12th. She barely spoke today. I tried to bring up the appointment, but she looked at me like I'd asked her to dig her own grave. I hate this. I hate not knowing what to do. I wish I could fix it. I wish I could trade places. Julia's hands trembled. These weren't journal entries. They were private confessions, raw, messy, honest in a way he had never been with her. She flipped through the pages. May 4th. I found her crying in the shower again. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it worse. I just sat outside the door like a coward. Why am I always too late to comfort her? July 16th. We didn't celebrate our anniversary. I don't think she remembered. I pretended not to either. It felt easier than facing her disappointment. She stopped reading. Her eyes burned. So many nights she had spent blaming him for being distant, for not understanding, for never asking her how she felt or what she needed. But here it was, proof that he had noticed, that he had cared, that he had hurt, just as much as she did, only silently. What kind of man pours his soul into notebooks, instead of into the arms of his wife? She wanted to scream at the pages, at him, at herself, because now it was too late to have the conversations they should have had. All she had left were these echoes in ink. She returned to the trunk and began pulling out more, notebook after notebook, year after year, revealing the quiet heartbreak of a man unraveling at the edges. There were no grand declarations, no melodrama. Just the steady erosion of hope, 1,000 moments she had forgotten or misinterpreted, 1,000 things he had kept buried, thinking he was protecting her, or maybe protecting himself. But the last notebook was different. It had no year. Just a single word written across the front in sharp black ink. For Julia. She froze. The air around her seemed to still. The only sound was her heartbeat, loud and sudden in her ears. Her fingers hovered above the cover, afraid to open it, not because she feared what it might say, but because she feared what it might change. This one was intentional. Left behind, hidden, meant to be found, but not too soon. She slowly opened the cover. There was no greeting, no date, just his handwriting, steady and unmistakably his. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Or maybe it means you finally decided to come down here. Either way, you're here, and I owe you the truth. Her breath caught. You always thought I left because I stopped loving you. I never stopped, not for a moment. I left because I didn't know how to reach you anymore, and because I didn't want to be another weight dragging you down. Julia sat down on the cold cement floor. Her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She kept reading. You were the strongest person I knew, still are, but I saw how grief changed you, and I didn't know how to carry both my pain and yours. That's not an excuse. It's a failure. I know that now. She turned the page, hand over mouth. I wrote these notebooks because I couldn't talk to you, and because I was afraid that if I did, I'd say the wrong thing and lose you even faster. Cowardice dressed up as caution. I convinced myself that silence was safer, that you needed space, not words. But maybe silence is what broke us. The beam of the flashlight dimmed slightly. She didn't move. I want you to know one thing, Julia. You never stopped being enough, not for a second. Even at your lowest, you were still the only light I had. I just didn't know how to tell you that when everything else was dark. The last page held no signature, just one line. I hope someday you'll forgive me. She closed the notebook slowly. Her fingers rested on the cover for a long moment as she stared into the dark, her breath fogging in the cold basement air. The silence around her was no longer empty. It was full of his voice, his fears, his regrets, and hers. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, minutes, maybe hours, but when she finally stood, she did so differently than when she came down. There are truths that hurt, and truths that heal. This was both. And somewhere, deep inside, something shifted. The next morning arrived like a quiet apology. Gentle sunlight spilled across the kitchen countertop, warming the same place where Julia used to pour 2 cups of coffee. One for herself, one for him. Now, there was only one mug. Her hand gripped it, but her mind was still in the basement. The notebook, his notebook, remained on the table, opened just enough to show his final words from the night before. "I hope someday you'll forgive me." She hadn't slept. Not truly. She lay in bed with her back against the cold wall, listening to the old pipes hum and pop, her thoughts cycling through every fight, every silence, every missed opportunity where words could have healed. And now, the house wasn't just hers. It was a cathedral of unspoken truth. Her phone buzzed once, a text from her sister. "Just checking in. How's it feel to be back in the house?" Julia didn't reply. How could she explain it? How could she tell anyone that she had stumbled upon a secret archive of love and grief? That the man she divorced had been more vulnerable with paper than he ever was with her? She stood, walked slowly to the sliding door, and opened it. The backyard had grown wild. Weeds curled around the once manicured flower beds, the bench beneath the oak tree covered in fallen leaves. That bench, their bench, where they had talked about growing old together, about building a swing set someday. She stepped outside, the cold morning air brushing her skin. She sat down on the bench, pulled her sleeves over her hands, and just stared at the sky. She remembered that night after they lost the baby, how they sat there in silence, him rubbing her back without a word. She thought he didn't care. She wanted him to say something, anything. But now she knew. He was scared. He didn't know how to speak grief. The journals proved it. He had felt every drop of their sorrow. He just didn't know how to share it, aloud. Inside again, she looked at the basement door. It stood closed, but no longer threatening. The fear had turned into curiosity, and maybe a quiet yearning. What else had he left behind? She opened it and stepped down. This time, she brought a new bulb. When the light flicked on, it illuminated more than the space. It shifted the energy. It felt less like a basement and more like a vault, not of storage, but of emotion. She returned to the trunk. The notebooks sat in neat piles where she'd left them, but now she noticed something behind them. A framed object propped against the concrete wall. She leaned over, reached out and pulled it into the light. It was a painting, a portrait, of her. She stared at it, stunned. It wasn't flattering, not in a romanticized way. It was real. Her expression was tired, worn, and proud, like someone who had carried burdens too big to speak of. But he had captured her with care, with reverence, with truth. When had he painted it? He never mentioned painting. She thought of all the nights he'd stayed in the garage or claimed he was working late. Had he been painting her in secret? Had he been trying to preserve her the only way he knew? How? She ran her fingers along the frame. Dust clung to her skin, but underneath she felt something warm, something deeply human. And then she sat down on the floor beside it, not to organize, not to investigate, just to be still, to absorb. The room wasn't cold anymore, or maybe her heart had warmed. She didn't know how long she sat there, back against the cool wall, notebooks scattered around her like quiet ghosts. For once, the silence didn't press down on her. She picked up a new notebook, dated 2014, and flipped it open. His handwriting was slightly messier in these earlier entries, but quicker, less composed. But the voice was the same. She told me today that she doesn't need anyone. I know she didn't mean it, but it still stung. I want to be needed, even if just to hold her when she forgets how strong she's been pretending to be. Another page. I watched her fall asleep on the couch tonight. She looked peaceful. I wonder if she dreams about the life we thought we'd have. I do, every night. And sometimes, I hate waking up. Julia placed her hand over her mouth. She had spent years believing that he was the one who let go, that he had withdrawn because he stopped caring. But now she could see it, the pull of helplessness, the drowning man reaching out in silence. There had been love, always, just buried beneath fear and pride and miscommunication. She returned upstairs, with 2 more notebooks in her arms. She sat in the living room this time, near the window, letting the fading afternoon light illuminate the pages. In one, he wrote about the day she opened her bakery, how proud he had been watching her cut the ribbon. But then came something unexpected. I didn't tell her how scared I was, not for her but for me, that she'd outgrow me, that she wouldn't need my support anymore, that her success would only highlight how lost I feel in my own life. He had never said a word of this as she remembered that season, how he seemed more distant, how she thought he was just sulking or bitter. But now she saw it. It was insecurity. He didn't resent her growth. He feared being left behind by it. Had she ever asked him how he was doing? Had she ever noticed when he needed lifting? The truth was complicated. There was no hero in this story. No villain. Just 2 broken people trying their best with tools they didn't know how to use. As evening gave way to night, Julia lit a single candle on the table beside her. Not for ambiance, for presence. It felt right, sacred even. She opened the notebook labeled "For Julia" again, not to reread the beginning, but to continue. You used to sing in the kitchen, did you know that? You'd hum old songs and sway while stirring sauce. It was the most beautiful thing in the world to me. That was the sound of home, of peace. When you stopped singing, I knew something was wrong. But I didn't ask. I should have. She had forgotten that too. She didn't realize how much of herself had gone silent, and how deeply he had listened. I wrote all this not to win you back. I don't expect that. I just needed to leave something behind in case one day you ever wondered what was real and what was just exhaustion. She closed the book gently as if afraid the words would crumble. Tomorrow she would reach out. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with honesty. She wouldn't ask him to come back. She didn't even know if she wanted that. But she needed to say out loud the things she had shouted only in her head. She needed to say, I saw it too. I just didn't know how to tell you I was drowning too. Maybe this was closure, or maybe it was a new beginning, shaped from ashes. All she knew was this. The notebooks had broken something open in her. Not just pain, but possibility. That night, she went to bed with the candle still burning, and for the first time in a very long time, she dreamed of him smiling. There's a moment, just after waking but before fully rising, where the mind floats in the space between dreams and clarity. That moment is fragile, weightless, and on this particular morning, Julia lingered there longer than usual. Hadn't intended to sleep so long. The candle from the night before had burned down to its base, leaving a tiny pool of wax on the nightstand. The light that filtered in through the curtains was gray, not yet morning, not quite the end of night. There was something timeless about it, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and reached for the notebook she had fallen asleep beside. I hope someday you'll forgive me. Those words still lingered like perfume in the air. Not begging, not desperate, just honest. She reread the paragraph that followed, letting his handwriting speak again. The curves of his letters, the firm way he pressed his pen into the page. She could feel the tension in his hand, the pause between thoughts, the quiet deliberation in every phrase. It was like sitting across from him at the kitchen table again, except now, finally, he was speaking. Julia slid her feet into slippers and made her way into the hallway. As she passed the living room, she noticed the pile of notebooks stacked neatly beside the couch, as if they had been arranged for someone else to find them next. But no one would. The house was hers alone now. Down the hallway and into the kitchen, she moved like a person in a museum, reverent, cautious. The coffee machine clicked on as she poured water and measured out grounds. It was a routine, a ritual she hadn't realized she missed. But it wasn't the coffee she needed. It was the warmth, the anchoring of something simple. Steam rose. The scent filled the air. She held the mug in both hands, stared out the window, and tried to name the feeling that had taken root in her since finding the trunk. It wasn't sorrow, though it sat nearby. It wasn't regret, though that too lingered. No, it was something quieter, something alive. Reconnection, with a man she once loved, with a version of herself she had buried, and with the truth, raw, uneven, but finally surfaced. She opened the sliding door and stepped into the backyard again. The air was cooler than the day before. The sky was overcast, with a slow breeze sweeping through the trees like fingers combing through hair. She walked barefoot through the grass, pausing by the garden beds that had become overgrown. Here were the herbs he tried to plant and failed to water. There were the tomatoes they argued over. He wanted cherry, she wanted beefsteak. Stupid things. Beautiful things. She sat on the bench again. It felt warmer this time, or maybe she was. And then, like a whisper she couldn't explain, her mind returned to the basement, to the painting. It had haunted her all night, not because of how accurate it was, but because of what it represented. He had seen her. Truly seen her. Not the smile she put on for others. Not the mask she wore when grief crept in. He had painted her as she was, tired, fierce, fragile, beautiful in her own brokenness. She stood up. She didn't even realize she was walking until she was already inside the house again, making her way toward the basement. She flicked the light on, took a deep breath, and stepped down. The painting leaned against the wall where she had left it. But beside it, something else had shifted. A box she hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the bottom shelf. It was smaller than the trunk, lighter. She knelt, slid it out. The lid wasn't locked. Inside, photos, hundreds of them. Some printed on glossy paper, some Polaroids curled at the edges, some old enough to be fading from time. Julia inhaled sharply. Their entire life together was here, in images she had long forgotten, moments that had slipped between cracks in memory. Her first birthday in the house. A blurry picture of their dog, Rufus, leaping through autumn leaves. That weekend in Maine when they'd gotten lost on purpose. And then, a series of photos she had never seen. Snapshots of her, reading on the porch, laughing with paint on her cheek, asleep on the couch with a half-finished bowl of popcorn on her lap, all taken from a distance, all candid, all through his eyes. He had been documenting her, not obsessively, not secretly, but lovingly, like someone trying to hold on to the essence of a person who was slowly slipping away from him. She ran her fingers across one particular photo, her sitting in the corner of the kitchen floor, legs pulled to her chest, face turned away. She remembered that moment. It was the day they lost the baby. She hadn't known he took the picture. Tears fell before she could stop them, not because of the sadness, but because in that moment she realized something she had missed all along. He had been grieving too. Not just for the baby, but for her. For the loss of the bright-spirited woman he had married. For the distance that widened with each passing week, no matter how tightly they clung to each other. He had been trying, in his own flawed way, to keep her close. And now, years later, she was finally seeing it. Julia rose from the floor, carried the box of photos upstairs, and laid them out across the dining table like a map. One by one, she arranged them in order. By seasons, by smiles, by the shifting lines on their faces. She didn't know what she was doing exactly, but it felt right. It felt like honoring something sacred. She spent hours there, cataloging, remembering, forgiving. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. Still. Healing. And by nightfall, Julia had made a decision. She would call him. Not to reopen wounds, not to ask questions he couldn't answer, but to say 3 simple things. I found what you left. I read your words. I see you now. Whether that conversation would lead to reconciliation, she didn't know. It wasn't about that. It was about presence, about not letting silence have the final word again. It took her until the next morning to gather the courage to dial his number. The phone sat on the counter like it knew what was coming. Waiting. Expectant but patient, she stared at it while sipping her coffee, her mind swirling with 1,000 rehearsed lines. But none of them felt right. There was no script for this. She picked it up, scrolled through the contacts, paused at his name. It was still there. Daniel, just as she had saved it years ago. No emoji, no nickname. Just Daniel. Clean. Simple. Heavy. It felt strange how permanent a name could seem in a world that had crumbled. Her thumb hovered above the call button. What if he didn't? Pick up? What if he did? She pressed it. The ringing felt longer than usual. Too long. Her heart thumped in her chest, her breath shallow. She nearly hung up. Then, click. Hello? His voice. Not through paper. Not filtered through memory. Real. Immediate. And it struck her like thunder in a still sky. Hi, she said. And for a moment, silence. Familiar, but not hostile. Julia, he said quietly. She closed her eyes. The sound of her name in his voice was like unlocking a door she hadn't realized was still shut. I found the notebooks, she said. The trunk in the basement. A pause. I figured, if you're calling, then you found them. There was something in his voice. Cautious, like stepping barefoot over glass. I read them, she said. All of them. Another silence. Longer this time, but full of breath. I wasn't sure you ever would, he admitted. That's why I left them there. Her voice cracked a little. You could have just told me. I know. Why didn't you? There it was. The question that weighed the most, not just for her, for him too. Because I was a coward, he said. I thought silence was safer, that maybe you'd hurt less if I didn't say how much I was hurting too. Julia leaned against the counter, hand gripping the phone tightly. You were wrong, she whispered. I know. They didn't cry, not yet. It was too soon. The wounds were still fresh, but cleaner now, a little more visible under the light. I saw the painting, she added, and the photos. He chuckled softly. I never meant for you to see those. But you left them. He didn't answer right away. I guess part of me hoped, someday when things didn't hurt so much, you'd come looking for something. That made sense. She let that sit for a while. I'm not calling because I want to go back, she said gently. I don't know what I want yet, but I needed to tell you this. I didn't stop loving you either. I just got so buried in pain that I forgot how to show it. I know, he said. The simplicity of those 2 words undid her. He knew, and that changed everything. They talked for hours, not about big things, not about the miscarriage, or the day he moved out, or the things said in anger. Those would come, later, if at all. They talked about music, about Rufus, the dog they had shared, about how the porch steps still creaked, about how the neighbor's kid finally graduated high school. It wasn't a conversation of reunion, it was one of reconnection. At one point, she laughed, really laughed, and he did too. They were 2 people standing on the ruins of what was, not rebuilding yet, but clearing the dust. Laying bare the foundation to see if something, friendship, forgiveness, or simply peace, could grow there. When the call ended, there were no promises, no let's try again, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet, I'm glad you called, and a soft me too. Julia stood in the doorway afterward, phone in hand, watching the wind ripple through the trees. The house didn't feel like a grave anymore. It felt like history, like truth. That evening, she gathered the notebooks into a small wooden box and placed them on a shelf in the living room. Not to hide them, but to honor them. They weren't secrets anymore. They were part of the architecture now. She wrote him a letter. Not long, just a page. Thank you for loving me in the only way you knew how. I wish we had been braver with each other, but I'm grateful for your words. They helped me find mine again. She didn't send it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But writing it was enough. In the days that followed, she opened the windows wider. Let more air in. She played music while making dinner. She sat in the backyard and hummed without realizing it. She began to sing again. Quietly at first. One morning, she walked past the mirror in the hallway and paused. She saw herself, truly saw herself. Not as the woman who was left, not as the woman who lost, but as the woman who survived, who learned, who listened. There are stories we tell ourselves after love ends. That we were right, that they were wrong, that the past should be buried. But sometimes, the truth lies not in the blame, but in the bravery it takes to return to the beginning and read what was always written between the lines. Julia didn't know what the future held, whether she'd fall in love again, whether Daniel would stay in her life as a friend, a memory, or something else entirely. But she knew this. She had found herself in the basement, and that was more than she ever expected. The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike any Julia had known before. It was slow, contemplative, a rhythm of rediscovery. The house still creaked in the same places, and the floors still sighed underfoot, but something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't the house that had changed. It was Julia. She woke up earlier now, not because she had things to do, but because she wanted to greet the day. The sun rising over the trees behind the backyard painted the sky in pinks and oranges, and she'd stand at the kitchen window watching it like someone seeing color for the first time. The light made everything golden, even the past, and maybe that was the miracle. That pain, when processed through grace, could become light. That what once haunted could now heal. She had resumed small tasks, things that had once overwhelmed her. She cleared the garden beds, pulling weeds until her gloves were stained and her muscles ached. She found a forgotten box of herb seeds in the pantry, marked with faded dates and hopeful handwriting. Probably his, maybe hers. She planted them anyway. Each tiny seed she buried felt like a promise. Not to him, not to the past, but to herself. A promise that life would continue, that growth could come from broken soil. As the days turned to a week, Julia found herself pulled once more toward the notebooks. She had read them, yes, every page, every word. But now, she was reading between the lines. She wanted to understand not just what he said, but why he said it the way he did. She noticed patterns, the way he always used her full name when writing about moments he admired, or how he scribbled and rewrote when expressing regret. There were places where ink had bled through the page, as if the pressure of his thoughts could not be contained by paper. And then one afternoon, she came across a page she had somehow missed before. It had been tucked between two other entries, folded like a letter. It was, to the version of Julia I was too afraid to face. She sat down. You're probably angry. I would be too. But if you're reading this, it means you found everything I couldn't say out loud, and I just want to say one thing more. Thank you. Thank you for carrying what we couldn't name. Thank you for being stronger than I ever told you. I failed at being the man you deserved, but I never stopped loving you, not once. It was signed only with a single letter, D. She traced the edge of the paper. That note hit different. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an apology. It was acknowledgement, the kind that comes too late but still matters. Later that evening, Julia walked to the attic. She had avoided it for years. Unlike the basement, which had become a museum of memory, the attic felt like a forgotten tomb. Dust layered thick on every surface. Boxes sagged under their own weight. Cobwebs clung to the corners like old guilt. She pushed the wooden ladder down and climbed slowly, flashlight in hand. The attic smelled of cedar, mildew, and time. She pulled the chain light, and a dull yellow glow spread across the space. One by one, she opened the boxes. Most were old holiday decorations. Some were baby items they had stored away after the miscarriage. Tiny shoes, a pale green blanket, a mobile with pastel stars. She sat cross-legged on the floor and cried. Not the sharp gasping sobs of fresh grief. This was something softer, a grief that had matured into reverence. She let it come, let the silence hold her. When she opened the last box, she found something unexpected, a small camcorder, dusty, but intact. Her fingers hesitated before turning. It still worked. Inside a single tape, labeled only with a date, 5 years earlier. She clicked play. The screen flickered, and then, her laughing, cooking in the kitchen, looking up in surprise when she saw the camera. Daniel, stop. Recording me, she said mid-chop with a wooden spoon in hand. He laughed behind the camera. I can't help it. You're magic when you're not trying. She watched herself blush, roll her eyes, then smile. That smile, she hadn't seen it in years. The eyes. Tape cut to another moment. She was sitting on the porch, feet in his lap, a book in hand. He zoomed in slowly, then whispered something the mic didn't catch. But her smile deepened. She put the book down and looked straight into the lens. I love you, you know that? The screen went black. Julia stared at the tiny screen for a long time, holding the camcorder to her chest like a relic. It was real. It had always been real. There, love didn't fail. It fractured. It stumbled. It gasped for breath in a storm too heavy for both of them. But it had been love, imperfect, messy, flawed, and true. She carried the camcorder downstairs, plugged it into the TV, and replayed the clips over and over until the sun had dipped below the horizon. That night, something extraordinary happened. And it wasn't dramatic or loud. It was small, but real. Julia slept. Not a restless doze, not an exhausted collapse, but true, uninterrupted, peaceful sleep. And in that sleep, she didn't dream of loss. She didn't dream of regrets. She dreamed of music. In her dream, she was dancing in the kitchen, barefoot, swaying to an old jazz tune, and Daniel stood nearby smiling, just watching. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The silence wasn't absence anymore. It was presence. She woke up with tears on her cheeks, but a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was strange, this feeling. Not joy. Not yet. But something, neighboring it. Something close enough to feel its warmth. As the morning sun filtered through the blinds, Julia found herself humming. She didn't even notice at first. The melody slipped past her lips the way old habits do. Soft, familiar, uninvited, but welcome. It was the same tune she used to sing while cooking, back when the world felt simpler, back when love hadn't yet been tested by tragedy. She stood in the kitchen, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter, and let the music fill the room. It wasn't perfect. She missed a few notes. Her voice cracked, but she sang anyway. Later that afternoon, she returned to the garden. The seeds she had planted had not yet sprouted, of course, but the soil felt different. She knelt, pressed her hand into the earth, and smiled. New beginnings never start with fireworks. They start with dirt, with digging, with faith. She spent the rest of the day cleaning, not out of obligation, but as an act of renewal. She opened drawers, sorted through forgotten papers, donated old clothes. With each drawer she emptied, with each box she sealed, she felt lighter, like shedding a skin that no longer fit. And then, in the very back of a closet she had ignored for months, she found one last surprise. A letter, folded, yellowed at, the edges tucked inside an old paperback novel. She opened it slowly. If you ever find this, it means I didn't do a good enough job hiding it. Or maybe it means I wanted you to find it all along. She froze. Daniel's handwriting again. But this letter wasn't dated. It wasn't part of the journals. This felt older, like something written during the breaking, in the thick of their unraveling. There are days when I want to shout at you, Not because I'm angry, but because I feel invisible. Like I've become part of the wallpaper. I know I've made mistakes, big ones. But so have you. And maybe that's what marriage is. Not perfection, but mutual forgiveness in the face of constant imperfection. Julia's hands trembled. I'm writing this not to accuse you, but to remind myself that love is not a feeling. It's a choice. 100 small choices, every single day. And lately I think we've both been choosing fear. I don't know how to fix us. But I'm still here. For now. The letter ended without a name. No signature. Just blank space. She folded it back up, pressed it against her heart, and stood there in the quiet. It was a window into a moment they never talked about, a glimpse into the heart of a man whose silence had always frustrated her, and now softened her. That evening, Julia did something she hadn't done in years. She cooked. Not out of routine or hunger, but out of love. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone else. For herself. She made their favorite dish, creamy garlic pasta with roasted tomatoes and basil. The smell filled the house like memory, like a hymn. She set the table, 1 plate, 1 glass of wine, and before she took the first bite, she whispered, "Thank you, for everything, even the silence." The next morning, she called him again. Their conversation was lighter this time. They spoke of ordinary things, movies, weather, books. She told him about the seeds she planted. He told her about the stray cat that had started showing up at his back door. They laughed. And then toward the end of the call, he said, "You sound different." Julia paused. "I feel different. I'm glad. So am I." They didn't talk about the future. They didn't make plans. But in that silence between words, there was peace. A shared understanding that healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means going forward with gratitude for what was. As the sun set that evening, Julia sat on the porch with a cup of tea and reread one of his notebooks. Not to analyze, not to ache, but to remember, to honor the truth that love, even when lost, leaves behind seeds of something sacred. She thought of how far she had come. From a woman drowning in grief, to a woman standing barefoot in her garden, unafraid of dirt, of growth, of trying again. She didn't know what tomorrow held. But tonight, she felt whole, and that was enough. There's a subtle shift that happens when grief begins to loosen its grip, not a dramatic release, but a softening. Like the tension in a clenched fist slowly easing open. Julia felt that shift in the smallest of things. The way her breath came easier, the way the sunlight through the curtains no longer seemed to expose her but embrace her. 2 weeks had passed since she first opened the trunk in the basement. 2 weeks since she read Daniel's words and found pieces of herself in the spaces between them. And now, the house no longer echoed like a tomb. It breathed with her, lived with her. She found herself humming while she made the bed, not the songs from before. Not yet, but something new, something unnamed, a tune born from this moment of becoming. She didn't know the words, but her body remembered rhythm, and that was enough. Her morning coffee had become a ritual. Not just caffeine, a ceremony. She'd sit on the porch with a blanket over her knees, eyes closed, listening to the birds argue in the trees. She didn't rush. The world would move fast enough without her. Here, time obeyed her pace. On this particular morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. She knew the handwriting immediately. It was Daniel's. Her heart skipped, then steadied. She waited. She didn't open it right away. She let it sit on the kitchen counter while she finished her coffee, washed the dishes, folded a load of laundry. She moved around it like one moves around a sleeping animal, aware, respectful, cautious. When she finally sat down, she ran her fingers over the envelope's edges, hesitated, then carefully tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "Dear Julia, I wasn't sure if I should write this. After our last call, I thought maybe silence was enough. but there's something about paper that still feels safer. Maybe it's the distance, maybe it's the permanence. Either way, here I am. Thank you. For calling. For listening. For not hanging up the second you heard my voice. I didn't expect grace. I didn't deserve it. But you gave it anyway. She paused, breath caught in her chest. I've thought about what I'd say to you for years. How I'd explain myself. How I'd try to justify the things I didn't say, didn't do, didn't fight for. But the truth is, explanations don't heal. Ownership does. So this is me, owning it. I hurt you. Not because I wanted to. Not because I stopped loving you. But because I didn't know how to carry my pain and yours at the same time. And instead of saying that, I vanished in plain sight. Julia wiped a tear from her cheek. I see now that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing. And I wasn't willing when it mattered most. But you were. And I should have seen that sooner. You were always braver than me. She folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest, and let herself cry. Not out of sorrow, but because something inside her, a wall she didn't know was still standing, finally came down. That afternoon she walked through the house with fresh eyes. She paused in the bedroom doorway, then stepped in. She hadn't spent much time here. It had felt too heavy, too haunted, but now she saw it as a blank canvas. She stripped the bed, opened the windows, let the wind move through the room and carry away what needed to go. She changed the curtains, pulled down old photos, and rearranged the furniture. When she finished, it was still the same room, but it felt entirely hers. Later she sat down with a fresh notebook, not one of his. Hers. She hadn't written in years. Not since college, maybe. Not since the baby. Her thoughts had always come in bursts, half-formed, interrupted by grief or work or the weight of survival. But now she picked up a pen and began. Today I remembered who I was before I forgot. She paused, then wrote more. Page after page, she let herself speak again. Not to anyone else, just to the quiet voice inside that had long gone mute. She wrote about the miscarriage, about the night spent curled up on the bathroom floor, about the fear that she had broken something in him, or maybe in herself. She wrote about her guilt, about how she blamed him, blamed herself, blamed God. She wrote until her hand ached, and the ink ran out, and when she finished, she closed the notebook, held it to her heart, and whispered, "I forgive you." She didn't know if she meant Daniel, or herself. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter. Forgiveness was no longer a transaction. It was a surrender. That night, she walked barefoot through the house, lights dimmed, music playing softly in the background. She poured a glass of wine, lit a candle, and sat cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in a shawl her mother once gave her. The silence was no longer a void. It was space, for breath, for memory, for becoming. And she was ready now. Not for what came next, but simply to be present for what was. Julia had never thought of herself as someone who needed rituals. She used to move through life with a practical rhythm, checklists, tasks, responsibilities. She had always been the steady one, the fixer, the strong one. But grief dismantles even the most solid identities, and healing reshapes them. Now, she found herself creating new rituals, not for structure, but for tenderness. Every morning she began with silence. She'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, watch the light crawl across the wooden floors, and whisper a word of gratitude. Sometimes it was as simple as, "Still here." Other times it was more complex. A memory acknowledged, a pain named, and released, a hope spoken gently into the air. She had started writing daily in her notebook, not because she had anything profound to say, but because she no longer wanted to leave parts of herself unsaid. She was learning page by page that clarity often came through the act of witnessing her own truth. One morning, as she sat down to write, she flipped back through the previous pages and noticed something new. The tone had changed. Where once the words had been dense with regret and sorrow, they now breathed. They laughed. They wandered. Her handwriting had even loosened, no longer stiff and controlled, but free, like someone dancing barefoot in the grass. That same day, she received a package. No return address again, but inside was something unmistakably him. A book. A first edition of a poetry collection they had once shared long ago, back when they were still discovering each other. Tucked inside was a note. I saw this and thought of you. Page 47 always reminded me of you. She turned to the page. The poem was underlined, just 2 lines. You were never the fire. You were the match, the spark, the thing that dared the cold to burn. Julia closed the book and pressed it to her chest. Her eyes stung with the beginning of tears, but not the kind that broke, the kind that opened. She sent him a text that evening. Page 47 made me cry, in a good way. He replied minutes later. That's the only kind I ever meant to make you cry. They didn't speak on the phone that night, but the exchange felt enough. She didn't need hours of words. Just that small tether, that thread of acknowledgement between 2 people who had once built a home together, and who were now building something else entirely. That night, Julia dreamed of the child they had lost. But it wasn't a nightmare. The dream, she held them, not as an infant, but as something luminous. A presence, not male or female, just light. The child sat beside her in the garden, watching the wind move through the trees. They smiled, didn't speak. She woke up sobbing into her pillow, body curled tight. But there was peace in it. The kind of peace that comes only when a wound finally stops bleeding. Later that week, Julia returned to the basement for the first time since the night of the camcorder. This time she brought down a box of her own. Notebooks she had filled, photos she had chosen to keep, letters to herself. She placed them gently on the same shelf where his notebook still sat. It wasn't about comparison. It was about companionship. Her truth beside his, equal, valid, whole. She even added one of her grandmother's rosaries to the space, not out of religious duty, but because the beads reminded her of strength, of holding on when everything feels like slipping. Before leaving the basement, she whispered, "Thank you." She didn't specify who the thank you was for. Maybe Daniel, maybe the house, maybe herself, maybe all 3. The days grew warmer. Spring pressed its forehead against the windows. The garden began to stir. Tiny green shoots broke through the soil. A small miracle, a quiet affirmation that death is not the end of the story, that dormancy is not the same as emptiness. Julia knelt beside the herbs one morning and touched the new growth. "I see you," she whispered, and she meant it, both for the plant and for herself. That evening, she finally did what she hadn't dared until then. She invited Daniel over. Nothing heavy, nothing loaded, just, "Would you like to come by for tea?" He didn't hesitate. "I'd love to." He arrived the next afternoon, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and a bag of pastries from the bakery down the road. "I wasn't sure what you liked anymore," he said sheepishly. She smiled. "I'm still figuring that out myself." They sat on the porch, the air warm with new season energy. He looked different, not older exactly, but lighter. He didn't fidget as much. His eyes held still when they met hers. There was a long silence after their first few sips. Then she said, "I don't blame you anymore." He exhaled slowly. "I don't blame you either." They didn't need to say what they had once blamed each other for. It was understood. "I think we were both trying to survive," she said. He nodded. "We just didn't know how to do it together." She took another sip of tea. "Do you think we could try to know each other again?" He didn't answer right away, then, "I'd like that." They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. They didn't plan the future. They simply sat in the soft unfolding of the present, the porch beneath them, the wind brushing past, and the truth between them like sunlight after a storm. And that was enough. It was strange how easily Daniel fit into the house again, Not like before. Not with the rhythm of a husband returning home or the habits of two people sharing space. No, this was different. Softer. Slower. He arrived with presence, not expectation. And that made all the difference. They began to share small pieces of life again. Not daily, not even weekly, but intentionally. A walk through the park. An afternoon, coffee on the porch. A shared meal with stories from in-between years. They didn't talk about reconciliation. There were no romantic overtures, but there was something real between them again. Friendship, rebuilt on truth instead of illusion, and that for now was enough. Julia noticed something else too. She was beginning to dream again. Not in sleep, but in life. Little flashes of desire returned, not just for peace, but for joy. She wanted to travel, to plant a new tree in the yard, to try painting, like Daniel once had, to dance again, to love. Not necessarily someone, but herself. There was one morning especially that stayed with her. She was brushing her teeth, looking in the mirror, and caught her own reflection not as a stranger, but as someone she wanted to know again. The lines on her face no longer told a story of what she had lost, but of what she had lived through, and her eyes, those eyes that once looked hollow, now shimmered with something unnameable. She leaned forward and whispered, "Welcome back," and meant it. A few days later, Daniel brought a small package. No note, just a carefully wrapped parcel. Inside, a canvas, blank, and a set of paints. She looked up at him, surprised. He shrugged. "You once said you always wanted to try." "I did?" "Yeah. You said it after your sister's wedding. We were eating leftover cake in bed and you looked at a watercolor painting in the hotel lobby and said, 'I could do that, but messier.'" She laughed, the memory rushing back like warm wind. He placed the canvas on the dining table. "You don't have to. Just maybe." Later that night, after he left, Julia sat in front of the canvas with a glass of wine and stared at the white. It terrified her. The emptiness, the potential, the vulnerability of creation. She hadn't tried something new in years, but maybe that was the point. She dipped the brush into the red first, a bold choice, and then came the blue, then green, then yellow. There was no plan, no form, no rules, just color, just movement, just herself, freed from definition. When she stepped back, it wasn't beautiful, not in any conventional sense, but it was honest, and for the first time since she found those notebooks, she didn't cry. She smiled. She hung it in the hallway the next morning, right across from the mirror, a reminder that even blank spaces can become windows. That expression doesn't require perfection. That bravery sometimes is just doing the thing you always said you'd try. Over time, the house filled with more of these moments, a potted plant in the corner that she named Mercy because she almost forgot to water it, and yet it still bloomed. A journal by her bed filled with dreams and affirmations. A playlist of songs she used to love, now played loud during her Sunday cleaning routines. One afternoon, as she rearranged the books on her shelf, she found an old envelope, addressed to the baby they lost. Her handwriting. Fragile. Hesitant. She sat on the floor and opened it. "If you had stayed, I would have named you something soft. Something that sounded like laughter. I would have read to you at night and told you that the world is big, but love is bigger. I want you to know I'm sorry I broke afterward, that I couldn't hold the pieces, that I pulled away from him, from everyone, from myself. It wasn't your fault. You were only light. Wherever you are, if souls float, if spirits listen, I hope you felt loved, even if I never got to say it out loud." The letter ended, without a signature. She folded it carefully and placed it beside the box of memories in the basement. Later that evening, she told Daniel about it. They sat on the porch, legs tucked under them, as the sky turned golden behind the trees. "I wrote a letter to the baby," she said. He nodded. "I did too, once, but I never knew where to put it." "Maybe next to mine," she offered. He turned to her, eyes full of something deep and old. "You sure?" She smiled. "Yeah, I think it's time they were together, even if just in paper." They walked down to the basement together side by side. He placed his letter beside hers in the box. Neither of them cried. There was no ceremony, no words, just the quiet understanding that some wounds don't close, but they stop bleeding, and that's healing too. They emerged from the basement hand in hand, not because they were lovers again, but because in that moment, the weight they had carried separately for so long had finally been placed down, together. And sometimes that's what love becomes, not passion or fire, but shared burden. A willingness to walk into the hard places and say, "You don't have to do this." Alone, the following days passed like pages in a well-written book, unhurried, meaningful, quietly radiant. Julia's garden began to thrive. Basil, mint, rosemary, lavender. The once wild patch behind the house had transformed into a living tapestry. She spent hours barefoot in the soil, learning again what it meant to tend, to nurture, to hope. Daniel came by often, never uninvited, never expected, always welcome. They would talk, sometimes for hours. Other times they sat in companionable silence, sipping tea or wine or nothing at all. She never asked him where he went afterward, and he never asked if he could stay. They were both learning to live with space, with boundaries, with reverence. One afternoon, while organizing the hallway closet, Julia found something that made her laugh out loud. A box of cassette tapes. Old ones. Mixes they made for road trips. Songs scratched off the radio. Scribbled titles. In her handwriting and his. A cassette labeled Us Volume 1. She brought it into the living room, dug out an old player from the attic, and pressed play. The speakers crackled. Then came a song. Upbeat, cheesy, ridiculous. Their first couple song. The one they danced to in the middle of the grocery store aisle on their second date, laughing while strangers stared. She laughed again, then teared up. Daniel came by later that day. She played the tape for him. When the second song began, slower, sadder, tender, he reached out his hand. "May I?" She hesitated only a second, then she nodded, took his hand, and they danced in the middle of the living room. No music but the old cassette. No choreography, just sway, breath, memory, and forgiveness. She rested her head on his shoulder, and, for the first time in years, they moved in sync, not as husband and wife, not as broken people clinging, but as two humans sharing a moment of music and grace. When the song ended, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night, Julia wrote in her journal, "Today I danced with my past and I didn't flinch. I looked it in the eye and it smiled back. We're not enemies anymore." A week later, she was invited to speak at a local women's group, a support circle for those navigating divorce, grief, or sudden loss. A friend had mentioned Julia's story, how she had rebuilt, replanted, reclaimed herself. Julia agreed, reluctantly. She didn't consider herself wise, or strong, or exemplary. But she knew the power of hearing someone say, "I survived too." On the day of the gathering, she stood before a dozen women in a quiet community room. Her hands trembled. Her voice shook at first. But then she spoke. Not about the divorce, not about Daniel, but about rediscovery, about silence, and notebooks, and the gift of returning to yourself when all else falls away. She told them about planting herbs, about writing letters never meant to be sent, about letting grief soften instead of harden. And when she finished, the room didn't clap. It didn't need to. The silence was enough, a sacred kind of silence, the kind that holds space for what can't be spoken. Afterward, one woman approached her, mid-40s, nervous smile. She touched Julia's arm gently. "I lost someone too," she said, "but I never let myself feel it. Thank you for reminding me it's okay to feel." Julia embraced her, not as a counselor, not as a mentor, just as another soul still learning how to carry love and loss in the same hands. That night, Julia returned home to find a note tucked in her mailbox, not from Daniel, from herself. It was a note she had written months ago and forgotten. A part of an old journaling exercise where she'd been told to write a message to future me. She opened it. If you're still standing, you're already winning. Keep going. Keep growing. Keep singing, even if your voice trembles. She smiled, sat on the porch and watched the stars. She smiled, sat on the porch and watched the stars. The house behind her glowed softly, not haunted anymore, just alive. She reached for her phone and texted Daniel. I finally danced without fear. His reply came quickly. I hope you keep dancing, even if it's without me, especially then. She stared at the message, heart steady, and typed back, you were part of the music, but the rhythm is mine now. She placed the phone face down, closed her eyes, and leaned into the night. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was living. And that was the beginning of everything. There are endings we choose, and endings that choose us. Some are quiet. Others come with sirens. But the rarest of all are the ones that feel like a beginning dressed in goodbye. For Julia, the season had shifted. It wasn't just in the garden, though the herbs now stood tall, fragrant, proud. It wasn't just in the house, which had begun to hum with soft music, candlelight, and fresh air. The shift was within her. Subtle, unforced, but undeniable. She was no longer a woman trying to survive the loss. She was a woman becoming. It had been 4 months since she found the notebooks. 4 months since her history folded itself open, revealing truths she hadn't expected and emotions she thought she'd buried for good. The house had taught her things no therapist ever could. Things no friend had dared say aloud. That grief could be beautiful. That love, even broken, could still be real. That forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about release. She stood barefoot in the backyard one morning, dew chilling her skin, and looked up at the sky. Gray clouds rolled overhead, full but soft. The kind of clouds that didn't threaten a storm, only promised a slow rain. She welcomed it. Her fingers brushed the rosemary, the mint, the wild lavender that now overtook the corner by the fence. All of it had grown out of neglect, then tenderness. It reminded her of herself. That day she made a decision, not out of impulse, but because she was ready. She walked inside, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen and fresh paper. The top of the page read, Dear Daniel. It was not a love letter. Not a goodbye. Not a thank you or a confession. It was a reflection. A mosaic of all the things that had no other place to live. When I found the trunk, I thought you had left me a mystery to solve. But now I see it wasn't a mystery. It was a mirror. Each page showed me not just you, but me. The version of myself I had stopped looking at. The version who still believed in softness. You wrote because you were afraid to speak. I write now because I've finally learned how. We weren't wrong for each other. We were simply unfinished. Two people trying to build a home in the middle of an earthquake. And yet, I am thankful for every small moment we mistook for ordinary, for the way you watched me sleep, for the silence that, in hindsight, was always trying to say something kind. She paused, then wrote the words she had been circling around for months. I love you, followed by, I release you. She folded the letter and placed it inside a small envelope, tucking it into a drawer. Not to be sent, not to be burned, just to be kept, a sacred note sealed between 2 chapters of the same book. That evening, she invited Daniel for dinner. He arrived with a bottle of wine and 2 stories from his day. They ate slowly, laughed easily, and moved with the rhythm of 2 people who knew when to talk and when not to. After dinner, they sat in the living room, sharing silence like a favorite song. The house around them glowed in golden lamps and candlelight. It was the same house where everything had once ended. And yet here they were, no longer looking for a beginning. I'm moving, he said. She looked over, surprised, but not shocked. Where to? 2 hours north, small town. I got offered a position at a community center there, art program for kids. She smiled. That sounds exactly right. I didn't want to leave without telling you, without saying goodbye. The real kind this time. She nodded. There was no sadness in her eyes, just warmth, acceptance. A silent echo of, "Thank you for telling me this time." "I'll miss the porch," he said. "I'll miss the way you brought pastries and never remembered which ones I liked." They both laughed. Then, as the clock ticked softly in the background, he stood. She walked him to the door. Neither of them asked for one last moment. Neither of them reached for hands or lips. That chapter had already been written and read. Instead, she said, "Be good." He answered, "Be free." And with that, he was gone. But she wasn't empty. Not this time. She returned to the living room and lit a single candle on the table. A habit now. A ceremony for clarity. The next morning, she woke up with a mission. She opened her laptop and began writing, not in a journal, not a letter, but a manuscript. She didn't know if it would become a book. That wasn't the point. It was simply time to gather the pieces of her story into something whole. She wrote for hours. About the silence of grief. About the unspoken words that almost ruined her. About the trunk in the basement and what she found there. About what it means to carry the memory of someone you no longer belong to. About singing again. Her story, in her own voice. And with each page, something remarkable happened. She healed. Not from heartbreak, but from the version of herself who thought healing had to look like restoration. It didn't. It looked like letting go, like a garden reclaimed, like a woman dancing in her kitchen, with no one watching, like a canvas filled with color and no name. Weeks passed. The house grew quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. It wasn't heavy or hollow. It was spacious, welcoming, the kind of silence that waits to be filled, not with noise, but with intention. One day, as she was sweeping the front porch, a woman walked by with a stroller and stopped. "Hi," she said with a warm smile. "I'm new to the neighborhood. This house is beautiful." Julia smiled back. "Thank you." They chatted briefly, about gardens, about spring, about how the porch looked like something out of a novel. Before the woman left, she asked, "Do you mind me asking, do you live here alone?" Julia looked around, at the house, at the garden, at the open windows, at the space that once held heartbreak and now held hope. She smiled. "No," she said softly. "Not alone." She wasn't thinking of Daniel, or of the child she never held, or even of her past self who had once curled up in grief. She was thinking of all the versions of herself who had carried her here, all the Julias who had loved, lost, let go, and loved again. This time inward. She was surrounded by them, and they were dancing. That night, she wrote one final line in her journal. "I am the house now. I am the garden. I am the match and the fire. I am what remains and what begins." She closed the book, blew out the candle, and went to bed. Not to escape the world, but to dream about what else was possible, because now, anything was.